different hosting options and what your hosting options are with RCS, what your hosting options are elsewhere on your own, just kind of everything hosting. And we'll be talking with Morris Caen, our CTO at RCS. A lot of you have probably worked with him before, but if you haven't, this is Morris, and I'll let him introduce himself and kind of introduce his team and what they do and talk about what they do.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, my name is Morris Caen. I've been with RCS for about 5 years now. Prior to that, so since I did my first retail system back in 1993, and almost exclusively since that point, I've been working with retail technology, retail systems, retail hosting specifically. RCS has got a team of, we call them our managed services team. That's also been, each person on that team has at least 10 years of experience in this industry, again, specifically with retail, with hosting retail applications, retail infrastructure and technology. We have worked as a team with retailers with anywhere from 1 location to over 16,000 locations in the US. So pretty much all shapes and sizes of retail organizations out there we've been helping work with from a technology standpoint for a long time now.
Great. And I should mention, if you have any questions, please fill out the Q&A should be at the bottom center of your screen, or the chat, and we will make sure to get to those questions as we go along. But we'll be covering a lot of topics, so hopefully we'll answer most or all of your questions by the end. So let's get started. Basically, there's kind of 2 types of hosting, correct? There's cloud-based hosting or on-premises hosting. We call it on-prem for short. And so if you could just talk about the key differences between those 2 hosting options and how they impact retail operations.
Sure. So on-premises hosting is been around for a long time. It's your traditional, you've got in your store or at your headquarters, you've got your own servers, switches, firewalls, all your network gear, everything else there. That requires typically large upfront capital expenditures to acquire the equipment, and then you need technical expertise to configure it, set it up, maintain it, and keep it running. Additionally, that can also cause additional PCI scope for your organization as well. The on-premise infrastructure also requires kind of a hardware plan for the maintenance, but also hardware life cycle. So every few years, typically every 4 years, you want to replace and upgrade all of that equipment. If you don't do that, or sometimes even if you do, you can have hardware failures, and they can lead to days, and with current lead times on things, even weeks of downtime, if you have a failure within that hardware. Cloud hosting offers lower upfront costs, switching out to monthly operational expenses. It's still in a typical, like if you're a retailer hosting their own cloud environment, you're still going to have that same expertise to configure, maintain the equipment, potentially additional PCI scope, and be able to keep those resources up and running. It is easier to scale in a cloud environment. You can add new hardware or increase your hardware with just a few clicks and a reboot, and the system's back up and running. If there's a failure, it tends to transfer to new hardware on its own behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about replacing a hard drive, or if the machine goes down, that's all kind of handled on the back end for you. But the downside to that is it's typically the billing on most cloud environments is very unpredictable. It's kind of a utility style bill where it depends on how much you utilize the system in any given day, week, month as to what that bill looks like. And then you still need the same expertise to keep your systems running well. So you've still got IT staff overhead and people that are dedicated to maintaining the systems and keeping them running properly. And that's exactly why RCS developed the Aero hosting platforms. It was built specifically for retailers, and talking to our customers for a long time and working in the industry, People wanted something that's just a flat fee monthly. They want to know what their expense is going to be. They don't want something that's going to, vary by, 20, 30, 40, 50% every month. They want to just come in and know what their operations are going to cost, what it's going to take for their systems to keep running, and they don't want to have to mess with any of that. And that's kind of where Aero came from.
Great. And how does data security differ between cloud-based hosting and on-prem solutions? And what measures are in place to protect sensitive data?
Yeah, in either case, retailers of all sizes are the targets of attackers and hackers out there, right? Every week, it seems like we read about another company that's been breached, that's had attacks on them, and it's just relentless out there at this point in time. So data security and system security in general is absolutely crucial to the success of your business. You've got to have properly maintained, whether you're in the cloud or on premise, either way, properly maintained firewalls, endpoint protection, file integrity protection, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, failed login attempt monitoring, two-factor authentication. You've got to be doing firmware updates, Windows patching, regular reviews of your firewall configuration, reviews of your firewall logs. And all of these are essential parts to maintaining your compliance, but also for your security footprint. And so there's a lot of moving pieces. It's very complex. Inside of our environment and our Aero environment, we have all traffic closed off from the internet. All traffic comes to and from secure VPNs and can't be seen outside of that. And then we maintain all of those other pieces. We maintain our firewalls in Aero. We've got the endpoint protection, two-factor authentication, and we do all Windows patching, firewall patching, every other piece of that security footprint that needs to come in place. We do all the audits, logs, reviews, everything else to make sure the environment is secure and properly maintained.
Well, that's a lot of things there. It's not really just set up and set it and forget it kind of a system.
No, and that's just a subset of the list. You really probably don't want me to go through the whole list.
Great. What steps can retailers take to ensure business continuity during natural disasters or power failures when using NCR Counterpoint and their retail point of sale system?
Sure. The first best step is always going to be offline ticket entry. So if your server goes down, if there's a disaster, whatever happens, and for lots of other reasons, offline will help you. But to keep offline running, if it's a power outage, you need to have some large UPS at your register to keep the offline station up and running, possibly generators, although generator is definitely going to be expensive to maintain or to purchase and to maintain. And so, a UPS can help if your equipment is not like your infrastructure equipment, you don't have a large server, network gear, that stuff is easier to maintain from the cloud standpoint. Another thing to look at is using a firewall that has the ability to have multiple internet connections. So like a cable connection is primary, DSL or fiber connection from the phone company as a backup, or a 4G, 5G as a backup. That way, if you are in offline mode, you can continue to process credit card transactions.
Great. And how often should retailers back up their data, like their Counterpoint data, and what are the best practices that they can follow for data management?
So we would recommend doing a full SQL Server database backup nightly, as well as SQL transaction log backups hourly. So that way, if you have a backup from 2 a.m. this morning and your server goes down or your database goes down at 2 p.m. today, you don't want to go back and lose all the transactions you've had midday. So by doing hourly transaction log backups, you can roll back to the closest one to when your server failed. So your risk is basically an hour of data loss instead of close to a full day of data loss. But aside from just the SQL backups, there's, you also want to look at your restore process as well. So at least on an annual basis, I'd recommend going through a test restore to make sure your backups are working properly. You know how to restore them, you know how to get back to the data. And then also, where do you store that data? So if, again, kind of to your previous question, Ryan, about a natural disaster, if you're storing your backups at your store or your headquarters, it's hit by a natural disaster, you could potentially lose that if there was a flood, if there was a fire. So you want to keep those backups off premise somewhere, and would recommend keeping at least 7 days worth of backups at a time. To help with that, and this is for on-premise hosting, RCS has a Aero Vault product where you can back your on-premise solution up to our cloud space, and that way it'll help mitigate against that type of natural disaster or mitigate against losing those backups. So you followed the best practices, you have the backup, but they can still be destroyed in a fire just as quickly as the servers and the rest of the infrastructure. If you're backing up in the cloud, there's several ways you can do that. Typically, you can look at just the cloud has options for local storage, zone redundant storage, or geographically redundant storage. So that helps mitigate against that same type of thing. So if you're hosting in the cloud and you have local storage, that SAN or that server dies or crashes, you've now lost your backup, you've lost your storage. But if you use zone redundant or geographically redundant storage, if something happens in that data center, it can be restored from another data center or even potentially another area in the country, depending on what type of storage options you choose there. And then it's not really tied back to the backups, but also as part of that, would recommend looking at a full maintenance plan for your SQL server. So, the best way to avoid having the backup is avoiding corruption, avoiding problems in the data, and having a proper maintenance plan can help mitigate against those risks as well.
Great. Yeah, you never think that you'll need it, but it's a good thing to plan for if you're going to need some data backup.
Yeah, well, right. You never think you need it, and we certainly hope you never do. But we've actually just recently had customers affected by flooding in the Vermont and New Hampshire area, and have had to go back to their backups, unfortunately, because their businesses were affected by the floods.
Yeah, there's been a lot more extreme weather, even heat, I'm sure, can affect different things, and so.
Yeah, well, heat can certainly affect the power outages that come through at places.
Yeah.
We've had problems with that in the Southeast.
Yeah. What are some common challenges retailers face when hosting their NCR Counterpoint data, and how can they effectively be addressed?
Yeah, so there's several common challenges that we run into in the field when working with customers. I would say the most common is probably running into people who their servers haven't been maintained or patched. So they start running into problems because the equipment's dated, or because they haven't been doing kind of the list of some of the best practice items that we went through earlier. They didn't have those in place, so they start running into data corruption or drive failures, or falling behind on their patches, so they can be where they don't have proper endpoint protection. So they can end up with spyware or worse, ransomware, or just their systems hacked if they're not maintaining those things properly, which is where we don't want to see anybody fall out in those areas. And a lot of that, and aside from having those tools, also having the ability to monitor that infrastructure, so to see that you're getting drive errors, or that you're having problems with the RAM module, or that your server response times are slowing down. And then I would say one of the other more common things is customers not really adhering to a hardware life cycle. Right, they're not really budgeting out every 4 years I should be upgrading my servers or upgrading my back office computers or registers. And we try to encourage people to kind of get on a cadence on the registers, back office computers, do about 25% a year. That way, every 4 years, everything has been replaced without having to kind of bite the bullet of doing it all at one time. But we see this mostly in the servers, where people will have a server that they'll run for, 5, 6 years, and then a component dies, and then their whole business is down while they're trying to either get a replacement server or scrounge replacement parts or figure out a way to kind of fill in that gap to get their system back up and running again. And so those are probably the most common things that we see. Kind of in a self-hosted cloud environment, we run into not really challenges from, well, we can still see some things that haven't been configured or maintained properly, but one of the more common things we see is that they end up with their cloud hosting bill being exponentially more than they expected, because in most instances, those bills are kind of utility style bills where you pay for what you utilize. And sometimes things end up significantly different than where they thought they were going to be. And so again, that's kind of where Aero comes in for our customers. It's been designed to make things simple and easy and let us take care of those things on the back end.
Aero has a standard fee every month. It's
a flat fee based on number of users. Yeah.
Great. Can you provide examples of retail success, like business successes that where the retailer has migrated their Counterpoint data to the cloud and the benefits that they experienced?
Yeah, so we've done this with a whole lot of customers now, of migrating them to the cloud. And the main benefits they get are typically the ability to focus on their business. They're not having to worry about those large capital expenditures coming out. They don't have to worry about the backups, the security, and all the other pieces we've kind of talked to before. But we also hear things that kind of throw me off. We've recently migrated a new customer to the cloud, and working with them, one of their store managers and several of their cashiers were so excited to see the two-factor authentication. They said this was the first time in years they felt like their systems were kind of upgraded and improved, and they saw the business investing in new technology and having them go forward. And there was just a lot of excitement and buzz around the company for being in the cloud. And so it just really created energy for them. So aside from the technical benefits they got, aside from the time benefits they got, it was a huge morale boost for all of their stores to see that their systems have changed. They're more responsive. When they run a report, it was taking less than half the time to complete. Those types of things, kind of where we've been able to focus and fine tune on performance and the needs for the system, as opposed to just kind of building a system to get it by and to make it work. Because again, it's not the focus of our retailers their focus is in IT.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's nice to hear that it affected the employees as well, and the cashiers and everybody, and kind of the whole team was affected by it. That's great.
Yeah.
What factors should retailers consider when choosing between self-hosted solutions and managed hosted services for Counterpoint data?
Yeah, for me, one of the most important things to think about is skill set. How much time do you have? What's your budget for self-hosting? But even aside from the time and budget of, like, I look at it, if I take my car in the shop several times a year to get the oil change, to have maintenance performed. If something goes wrong with my car, I take it into the shop. It's not my expertise. You don't want me working on your car at all. You don't want me to touch it. And that's really where a lot of people fall of, they try to kind of maintain their own system. It's not their skill set. They already have a full-time job. They're, working 40 plus hours a week now, but, I'm going to kind of do this IT stuff on the side to, try to help out. Best of intentions. I mean, hearts are in the right place, but it doesn't always work out well. Because there's only so much you can get done in a day, so much you can get done in a week, and the same of your team. And so, letting RCS take care of this. Being a hosted Counterpoint customer for Aero, we can focus on those things that aren't your core skill set. It's not your core business model. The technology world moves very fast. It takes a very dedicated effort to keep on top of, the ever-changing best practices, the threats, compliance requirements, and, all of these moving pieces out here. It's really a full-time job to learn, to maintain, to keep on top of that. And that's what we're here for, is to take care of that for you instead of trying to manage all those pieces yourselves.
Great. And we kind of touched on this a little bit about performance, but how does hosting affect the performance and scalability of NCR Counterpoint, and what strategies can be implemented to optimize system performance?
Yeah, so, kind of if we go back to a self-hosted environment, you've bought a server, it's, X size, X capacity, whatever it can do. It's pretty much what it can do, unless you want to go out and either, buy a new server or add more RAM, add additional cores to it, bigger, faster hard drives, that type of thing. So it's kind of your performance is where it is versus in the cloud and in Aero specifically. For Aero, we're monitoring that performance all the time. We're watching it, we're keeping up with the CPU utilization, we're keeping up with memory utilization, drive IOPS, and looking at all those things to see if we're within specs, if we need to add more resources. And a great example of recently, we had a customer that had some customizations, and those customizations required enhancements in the product, and it required additional resources, required more memory. So we were able to add RAM. Just one evening, we had a maintenance window declared with them, and made some changes, rebooted the servers, and additional memory came back through. So it wasn't a process of acquiring additional hardware. It wasn't a process of having somebody come in and install it, right? So even if you bought RAM, somebody's got to put that in. You've got to have the skills to do that and the comfort to do that. So being in the cloud, being in Aero, it allows you to, one, you don't have to think about the performance. We're monitoring and watching that. And second, it's very easy to adjust if we need. And then third is kind of, we talked about on one of the previous answers was, the comments we've had from customers that have migrated has 100% been, this is so much faster than what they had before.
Yeah. Great. And then my final question, are there any compliance considerations or regulatory requirements that retailers should be aware of when hosting their NCR Counterpoint data, especially in the context of data protection?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, any retailer should be familiar with PCI compliance. There's a lot around that for anybody that's taking credit cards and what you have to do. And the more infrastructure, the more you have in your environment. So if you're hosting your own servers, there's certainly compliance pieces you have to look at. And, a lot of those compliance pieces come back to some of the things we talked about earlier. I think it was maybe the first or second question, where do you have file integrity monitoring? Do you have intrusion prevention and detection? Are you monitoring your firewall? I think the current PCI compliance requires, I believe it's quarterly audits of your firewall. Are you monitoring your logs? Are you monitoring your failed login attempts? And so, and then even aside from those things, you have to have written out practices. So do you have a security incident response? Do you have a process around, security training and awareness for the teams? So there's a whole lot of pieces that go into that. And it's the first few times you go through it, it's a pretty brutal process to go through and go gather all the documents, create all the documents for the audit. But, once you have it in place, keeping it there, maintaining that standard is easier, but it is a very time consuming and expensive process. I would say, most PCI audits that I've been through take around 3 months or so to complete. So it's not just, a quick meeting with an auditor and moving on.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, I kind of think the overall theme here is monitor and maintenance of whichever system you decide to go for, if it's on-prem or if it's in the cloud. There's just a lot of work that goes into it behind the scenes that you may not think about. And we have different solutions. If you're on-prem, we have the Aero Vault for backup. And if you are interested in learning more about Aero and hosting with us and having us do all the maintenance and upgrades and updates, we're happy to talk to you about that as well.
I'm very thankful. We've got a fantastic team that maintains, creates, monitors that entire environment. We're lucky to have the team we've got. It's a great group of people that have just a tremendous amount of wealth of knowledge in the retail space.